Welcome, welcome. Thank you to everyone joining us live for today's Lunch and Learn. This is what advocacy sounds like with the Halcyon String Quartet, and to all the viewers watching on YouTube later. Climate action work is incredibly important and rewarding, and it also can be pretty challenging. Luckily, the arts can strengthen communities, advance social justice, and sustain a strong, resilient climate movement. With us today is Sophie Davis, Artistic Director of the Halcyon String Quartet. Halcyon is a collective that combines imagery, art, data, and music to cultivate environmental stewardship and raise awareness of the impacts of climate change on Midcoast Maine. Sophie is joined by composer and former Rockland City Councilor Nate Davis, whose latest work, After All, combines music and the spoken word to contemplate the new realities of our world and the vulnerability and resilience of our community, of our humanity in the face of climate change. We are delighted to welcome you here today. As you've probably figured out, I am not Kathleen Meal. I'm just filling in for her today. My name is Will Sedlak, and I'm the political director here at Maine Conservation Voters and Maine Conservation Alliance. Our organizations represent more than 13,000 members and supporters dedicated to protecting Maine's environment and our democracy. MCA does that through education, collaboration, and advocacy, and MCV by influencing public policy, holding politicians accountable, and winning elections. A few technical notes for today's event. We will hear from our speakers first and tackle your questions in the Q&A session at the end. You do not have to wait though. Please send your questions to me, Will Sedlak, through the chat as they occur to you. I'll keep track of them and ask those questions following the presentation at the end. We ask that you please not message speakers directly, as we want them to focus on the presentation and not on the chat box. Please message Maggie Summers if you have any technical difficulties during the program. As a reminder, this program is being recorded and the video will be posted on our website later this afternoon, along with recordings of all of our previous Lunch and Learns. Thank you all again for joining us, and Sophie, I'll turn it over to you to kick things off.
Thanks so much, Will. So I'm Sophie, and I'm so honored to be here today with Nate, fellow musician, artist, activist, advocate. And as Will mentioned, I live in Maine, and I'm the artistic director of Halcyon. And we are a string quartet, but we're more broadly, I think, a collective that designs performances to raise awareness of climate change and of the impacts that we're all dealing with, kind of facing the challenges and opportunities that we face with climate change. So all of our performances celebrate Maine. They're based, we all live here. Well, 3 of us live here. And they reflect on challenges and opportunities we face here specifically. Many of our shows work with film or art. We work with scientists and artists from many different mediums to put together these programs. And it sort of originates from this realization that we need a creative and really diverse communication method that combines storytelling and music, visual art, to translate numbers and facts that we're kind of bombarded with every day in the media and news into something that's really tangible and human. So I'll talk a little bit more about Halcyon later, but we really want to share a piece with you that Nate wrote. That's the result of a several-year collaboration between Nate and Halcyon. And I'll let him introduce himself in the piece, and then we'll share a little excerpt of it with you.
Thank you, Sophie. As Sophie mentioned, my name is Nate. I apologize. Can you hear me? Great. All right, great. My name is Nate. I'm a composer. I used to be Rockland City Councilor, also an artist, a few other things as well. And a few years ago, I heard, right before the pandemic, I heard a performance of Halcyon I think it was in Waldoboro, the Waldo Theater. And I don't recall exactly what the program was, but it occurred to me pretty immediately that I'd like to write a composition for this group. I was impressed by both their musicianship, their musical commitment, but also their ethical commitment to the material. So I knew I wanted to write a work that would fit in with what they were doing, but I wasn't exactly sure what shape that work would take. And I knew I wanted it to have a textual component and to be related in some way to our local environment here in Maine. So I cast about for a text a while, and I exhausted my native repertoire of dead white male poets pretty quickly and couldn't really find a work that I thought was suitable for this occasion and this context. So what we ended up doing was actually soliciting testimony from the audience of Halcyon and the supporters of Halcyon, the email list, the people who attend their concerts. And we essentially got a set of responses back concerning people's hopes, dreams, concerns, and fears for the future here in Maine. I'll read the text of the prompt to you just to give you a little background. So this is what Halcyon sent to its audience to solicit a text for this piece. Near the end of his life, the poet William Yeats realized that he must find a new beginning in the foul rag and bone shop of the heart, the unordered chaos of human feeling. As we contemplate our warming planet, its divided communities, its joys and sufferings, we invite you to share your reflections on the following questions. Is our collective future a bright one? Can we change it? What does the world look like to you in 50 years? Who is we? Who are you? So it was quite a broad prompt, and we got quite a broad range of responses. One of those responses was the testimony of a 12-year-old girl who successfully brought solar panels to the town of Hope. And that testimony forms the core of the movement you're about to hear, which was taken from a private performance of this quartet. It's actually a quintet because it's quartet plus narrator. So it's the Halcyon String Quartet plus the wonderful actor and speaker David Troop as the narrator. So this testimony of this 12-year-old girl is the core of the movement you're about to hear. It's about 4 minutes long. And Sophie, why don't you cue up the video?
Great. So I'm just going to share this with all of you.
One, two, three, hi, I'm a 12-year-old girl. Hi, I'm a 12-year-old girl. Hi, I'm a 12-year-old girl that lives in Hope, Maine. Who looks out her window? Who looks out her window? Who looks out her window? As soon as she wakes up just to see the mountains standing strong. My brother and I brought solar panels. Solar panels. Solar panels to our town, starting with the one question. To our town, starting with the one question. To our town, starting with the one question. So many other towns have solar. Why don't we? Later, 120 panels were brought to our town after lots of meetings. Lots of meetings. Solar panels. Lots of meetings. Even after 64 years on this planet, I'm at a loss to describe human nature. I honestly don't know if our species with nearly 8 billion of us and counting, has the ability to act, dream, and work collectively toward a common goal. At the same time, I'm encouraged by the depth and breadth of the conversations we are having now around our colonial settler past, systemic racism, gender, our place in rather than outside and above nature. This recognition that we need to know where we've been to find a way forward feels like a new door opening. Is our future bright? And can we change it? We've been poking the earth with a stick and trying to bend it to our will for centuries. Now that it has come back to bite us, we are finally putting the stick down.
Thank you, Sophie. I feel like I could talk for hours about this, but I can't. So I'll try to just maybe mention a few things, a few salient points about it. One is that it turned into, because of the nature of this prompt and the nature of testimonies we received, a piece in some sense about climate change in Maine. So it's a piece specific to this time and place and this people too, us as a people. And that's really kind of a special thing for new music. Most new string quartets, and there aren't that many new string quartets in the world, but there are some. They're generally not occasional pieces or pieces really specific to specific contexts. They're often written in more academic settings, and this is, in some ways, well, as we're discussing, it's a mode of activism and advocacy, and really a sense of public engagement and outreach. As you heard, that movement begins with this testimony of the 12-year-old girl, and then it segues into a different testimony. I think that there are 9 testimonies in total woven throughout the 4 movements of the piece. And this piece was really somewhat of a stretch for me in the sense that, well, as I mentioned, this piece is a form of public engagement with these issues, whereas a lot of my earlier work, musical work and artistic work, was focused more on academic settings or contexts with less of a explicit social mission or activist mission or environmental mission. I think it's fairly successful though. I'm fairly pleased with it. And I hope you all get to hear it on February 2nd, which I'm sure Sophie will mention that opportunity. I could say more about this, but let's see how the rest of the time goes, and we're going to take questions as well. So Sophie, over to you.
Thanks, Nate. So as Nate said, the process of putting After All together was one that we are so honored to have been able to do. It's not every string quartet that gets a piece written for them, especially one that is so tied to the community where we live. So it's been a really special experience, and we are going to be playing it twice. Well, once in its entirety, as he mentioned, on February 2nd in Belfast, and that's a 7 o'clock show at 15 Front Street, which is the recently renovated building by the farmers market there. So that should be a really fun chance to hear the whole work. And then we're also going to be playing selections of it on February 4th at the Waldo Theater, and that's in conjunction with an ecologist, Janet McMahon, who's going to be speaking about the impacts of climate change on Lincoln County specifically. So there'll be a lot to learn in that presentation. But I did want to share just a little bit more about Halcyon in general and the ways that we are trying to use the arts to really grapple with climate change from the perspective of how we feel. I think there's a lot of talk about what's happening. We're bombarded with information about the impacts that climate is having on our homes, our way of life. I mean, it's kind of strange that today is one of the snowiest days we've had all winter and it's almost February. To me, that's sad. I this feels not normal to me, and I feel like I'm young to know what a normal is. So I think there's a lot of grief that we don't talk about with climate change, and what we're trying to do with Halcyon in part is make a space for people to really feel whatever they want to feel. It could be anger, frustration, inspiration, opportunity. But I think there's a really important need for that. And so I'm going to just share with you a few photos of some of our projects and talk a little bit about one in particular that we did last May, called Rise Up. And we're going to do a follow-up on that this spring, actually. And the program is focused around sea level rise. In the one we did in May was focusing on North Haven, Vinyl Haven, and Rockland. And we looked at the impacts of sea level rise in those three communities and kind of did a mapping experiment using Maine Geological Survey mapping, and then also animation of film footage. And the artwork of Jill Pelto, who is a phenomenal climate artist. Should check her out if you haven't heard of her. And facts. So just straight up objective facts about what is going on in these locations. And we're going to be adapting that to Portland later this spring for another show. But I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen and just show a few photos of some of these performances, just so you can see the setup. It's not a typical concert setup. There's always projection and a lot of speaking. So just share that with you. Second. So this is just a photo of, can you all hear me still? Okay, great. So these are just a few photos of the performances. This was a panel discussion that we had. And this was performing After All with David Troop in last spring. And then this is just kind of going through a little bit some of the context that we have in our slides. So when we're playing, for example, a piece by Bach, in this program, we said that the date it was composed, and then we showed what the parts per million in carbon dioxide was that year, which is rather shocking because we're over 400 now, but trying to put some of that climate data into a context that's historical as well. And then this is going through a few of the slides from our Rise Up show in Portland, just to show how we're trying to take science and data and put it into a context that might be a little more digestible and might be a little bit more evocative of different types of feelings. So, oops. Vinyl Haven is in Penobscot Bay, 12 miles off the coast of Rockland. So just getting people situated in a place. It's 170 square miles, most of which are water. A little bit of information about the population. And this is a map from the Maine Geological Survey. That's just an aerial photograph of Vinyl Haven's downtown. And these maps are all accessible for free online. And I think many people don't know about them. But what they've done, which is really fascinating, is they have shown what the projected sea levels are going to be under the different scenarios that the NOAA has put out, so the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association. And so you'll see here, this is with 2 feet of sea level rise. The areas in green are what will be flooded at a high tide. So it's not like this is always going to be underwater, but at the highest annual tide, these areas will be significantly flooded. And this is the major commercial area in the town. The ferry service and EMS services will be impacted. And actually, I'm going to back up for a second. So while this was all going on, we would have been playing a piece of music. So no one's speaking here, but there's a lot of time for people to just reflect on some of these imagery and some of this facts around it. And at a show that we did recently, we had a discussion afterwards with a number of other youth activists, a city planner, actually some legislators, to talk about how are we dealing with this? How are our towns dealing with these problems? And we did a word cloud. So I don't know if you are familiar with that, but where everyone in the audience we asked them to just tell us how they were feeling at the end of a show. And this is kind of what they came up with. So the words that are large were the ones that were repeated often. And it was interesting because sad and hopeful were the same size, which means they were put in by the audience the same number of times. And this is the first time we had done this. And it was really, really fascinating to see what people were feeling, what emotions the music and the imagery brought out during these shows. So what I'd love to do just to kind of end is I'm going to show you another film very quickly here. It's about 5 minutes, and it's what we showed as sort of the culminating feature of this Rise Up presentation. And it takes aerial footage. We work with a videographer named Luke Fatora, who does a lot of our filming and recording and collaborates on these projects with us. And he took all of this footage. Most of it was shot during a very high tide last winter on Vinyl Haven and North Haven, and animated these sea level rise scenarios that I just showed in those slides. So you'll see water start to rise, and where it rises to on the buildings is fairly approximate, but also somewhat accurate to these two scenarios, which are the most likely scenarios. And that is that sea levels will rise 4 feet by 2100 under a medium, that's kind of the optimistic. And under a high scenario with CO2 emissions, they'll rise by 9 feet by 2100. And so you'll see those two scenarios play out in this video. So I'll share that with you. Okay, so the piece doesn't actually end there, but I'm gonna leave you on a little bit of a cliffhanger there. So that's kind of just a brief example of the kinds of programs we're thinking about and the ways we're trying to share information in a way that is hopefully eliciting a feeling, and also just giving a chance for people to appreciate and grieve, because I think that is a really important thing that's going to be a part of our futures, and something we need to acknowledge. So I know we'd love to have time for questions. There's so much more we could say about this, but I'd love to open it up to, and Nate, if you have any other things you'd like to add.
I'll only just say that Halcyon is really a unique group and really a treasure, and I'd urge you all to support them by attending their concerts, by donating. It's really a remarkable thing to have, first of all, to have an independent string quartet, period, but especially one with some sort of environmental mission is really quite a unique thing. So please support them.
Yeah, that's a great segue, and wow, what a presentation. And so for our regulars who know it, at this point after the presentation, we do a little call to action. We will be sending you an email after this program, usually mid-afternoon on Fridays. But our call to action for this week really is to check out the Halcyon String Quartet more. We'll send you information on their website. And there are some performances upcoming. On Thursday, February 2nd, After All debuts in Belfast. As a former resident of Belfast, I'm very excited to hear that. And on Saturday, February 4th, Getting on Board, which combines multimedia elements and a reflection from the ecologist Janet McMahon, will be also performed. And I don't have the location for that, but I vaguely remember Waldoboro. Is that right?
Yes, it'll be at the Waldo Theater, and it's
The
at
Waldo
4.
Theater. Very cool. So those will be in the email this afternoon. And I think there's just get on the email list, sign up, support them. This is get in on the ground level here. This is really exciting. So I've got a bunch of questions here, and I hope folks continue to send me questions because I've so appreciated them. I think just to start is people want to know more about your backgrounds. You know, what kind of either training do you have? What got you to this moment? You know, working on these pieces, and just a little bit more on that. And maybe we start with Sophie, and then we go to Nate.
Sure. Yeah, so I grew up in Waldoboro. I've lived in Maine most of my life. I studied I studied violin and environmental studies in a double program at the Oberlin Conservatory in Ohio. So I went to school there, and environmental studies kind of got me thinking about this stuff a lot more. And I also took a climate change course in high school, which I feel very fortunate to have done, and that really got me thinking. And since then, it's been something I've spent a great deal of time thinking about. And then the intersection into more like advocacy work with the arts happens. I spent a year as a Fulbright scholar in Samoa in the South Pacific. And I was looking at how the arts can raise awareness of climate change and looking at Indigenous knowledge, and how climate change is being dealt with in other countries where it's a little bit ahead of where we are here, and that it's very visceral there. And so when I came back from that year, I really wanted to figure out how to do the same thing here, because I feel like some of those conversations aren't being had, or weren't. They're starting to be had here. And music is where my heart is, so I wasn't willing to choose one direction. And so we formed Halcyon in 2019. And it's kind of been growing. It's a work in progress all the time. We became a nonprofit last year, and have kind of been just trying to build as much as we can, knowing that we all also have other work and other jobs, but it's definitely the passion project of where I'm at.
Well, I just got a flurry of messages saying, dang, Sophie's impressive. So thank you for sharing that journey with us. Nate, how about you?
Well, I also have an academic background in music. I have a PhD in music theory and composition, as well as a master's degree in mathematics. And what I hope to achieve in the world through art has really changed quite a bit for me over the last 20 years, let's say, as long as I've been doing really public-facing art. I began as a composer in a much more academic tradition, descended from people like, I'd say maybe from the mid-century American modernist tradition. So people like Elliott Carter, Charles Warren, Milton Babbitt, if you know any of those names, but, you know, fairly sort of high dudgeon intellectual stuff. And that's still close to my heart. Eventually, I became, as many people do, somewhat disenchanted with the academic music scene, to the extent that there is a scene, and the goals of it and the culture of it. And along with that disenchantment, or maybe accompanying, or even because of that disenchantment, I really just, when I was much younger in college, I was more of a sort of an explicit activist, going to demonstrations and things like that, and then went to graduate school, started working, and that became less a part of my life. My wife and I moved here to Maine in 2013. I grew up in New Hampshire, and maybe just as a part of settling down into a place where we intend to live for the rest of our lives, I've steadily become more concerned with public engagement and activism, and just trying to live a publicly ethical life, let's say, rather than simply a privately ethical life. And in my artistic practice has taken somewhat of a turn from the relatively insular world of academic music to things more like this. So as I said, this piece was somewhat of a stretch, because this is really, there are passages of this piece that are written in the style of this piece, after all, that we discussed, that are written in the style of Schubert, let's say, or even more folk idioms, which is something that is quite new for me, and quite a departure outside of exercises and improvisation. But actually write a public-facing piece in this mixed style was a stretch. So now, as maybe a sequel to this, I'm working on a big piece about alchemy. Well, it's not actually a piece about alchemy, it's a piece of alchemy, and that's a distinction. I'm trying to get into the mindset of the medieval alchemists, and that's a piece for this collection of musicians at Florida State University. But again, it's a piece with a very public mission, and a much broader interpretation of, a broader understanding of what can be achieved in art and public engagement. Yeah, that's what I'll say for now.
I'm going to be thinking about this alchemy thing for quite a bit here, Nate. And just to say, I'm a little envious of anybody in your household that gets to do the Sunday piano puzzler with you, with all of that background there. So much envy. In terms of just I think there's a lot of people that were really interested in the process for you all, and I think about, you know, and especially in the second piece with Adagio for strings and the images and how those kind of interplayed with each other. You know, the music and the visuals matched up so well. You know, what was the process for combining those? And I guess, did you start with Barber, or did you start with the images? And tell us more about that.
Yeah. That's my favorite part. That's what I, it's such a creative kind of, it's a really definitely learning process. In the case of the Barber, we've been planning to do a show around sea level rise for quite a while, and then COVID happened. And I think for Halcyon anyways, that piece just kind of screams sea level rise. It builds and builds and builds, and there's this epic climax, and then it kind of comes down, and it's also really sad. And so I think in that was kind of like a immediate go-to piece for us with that. Often other times I think it gets more challenging. We do a great deal of listening, especially recently, because I think there's kind of going to music school, we're trained in this very Western classical canon of music, and there is so much more out there. And I think for the multimedia side of things, a lot of the more contemporary pieces with textures and different sound worlds that are created, it feels a lot easier to put imagery to that for us. So we'll do a lot of listening, and we'll just kind of brainstorm and think and really create storyboards like you would in a film. that show different images that come to mind with different sections of the piece. And typically that the barber is meant to be, it was a live performance, but we just synced the video in for that so we could share it with people after the fact. But typically we're very fortunate because our videographer is also a wonderful violinist. And so he's a musician and is following, he's knows the music in some ways better than we do, because he's following along in the scores and advancing these clips of film to line up exactly with the music that we're making in real time. So we can be spontaneous, we can perform in a way that we want to musically, that doesn't feel tied to like a metronome marking or a really rigid structure. So it's really a tag team. It's a lot of listening and then kind of playing around with different imagery with the music in mind, and also research. I think I spend probably half of my time with these projects just doing straight up research about what is going on. What were the parts per million when Bach wrote this piece? What did the world look like at that time? And I learned so much about this area, Rockland, Vinyl Haven, and North Haven. I live in Rockland, but I didn't know half of those things. So I think a lot of it is just learning and then kind of going down a lot of rabbit holes to decide what's worth sharing and what might fit with certain pieces. And it's also an evolving process. It's changed with every performance and it's getting easier, but there's always a moment of being very stuck. Like, I don't know where to go from here. And kind of have to work through that process.
I appreciate you referencing rabbit holes, and I think I'm following a few viewers down a few rabbit holes here, and I kind of want to tie them together, which is, you mentioned, this notion that music can, well, especially that second piece, evoke despair and kind of the full range of pathos and emotions and everything else. But we have some people here that will also, talk about the role that music plays in kind of large movements, whether that's, the civil rights movement here in the United States, the movement to end apartheid in South Africa, the union movement, and thinking of, Pete Seeger and Woody Guthrie, and, certainly, kind of the role that music has played to tie, the communist movements around the world. Is there a role for Halcyon to focus on another piece on kind of hope? How would you do something that isn't despair, that also, recognizes the moment we're in and uses music to kind of rally people in a different direction, I suppose? And is that kind of on the horizon?
Yeah, I think so. That's something that's really hard for me personally, and I think everyone, when we're working on these projects in Halcyon, I want so badly to do that, and we're trying to think of ways to do that feel really genuine. I think it's easy to say, let's be hopeful, look at the solar panels next door, and that's fantastic. Like, I am 100% on board, but there's so much deeper that goes beyond that, and I think I also think there's that need is vital, is just as vital as any other need, but I think it's hard to figure out how to do that. And one of our kind of big project this year is we're in the process right now trying to figure out how to end it in a way that feels genuinely looking at some of the hopeful futures. And I think what we're kind of settling on is how can we create a visual depiction of a future that feels really good, that is where we've come through this on the other side. And to me, that's where I get hope, is that it is possible. And we're very smart people. We have so much potential. And I think it's kind of like, we don't really have a choice. There's one very clear choice. We just need to get our act together and make that happen. And so I think, for me, it's looking at how can we show people that future is actually a really bright one, and it might take some sacrifice and some personal changes, but it's kind of the only option that we have. And so that's kind of one way. I don't have a great answer for that, and I would love to hear some ideas if folks have them. But
well, and I think and maybe a jumping off point for ideas is, are there songs or music or pieces of art that you both listen to or kind of draw inspiration from for clarity, healing, courage, solace, as you think about the climate crisis? Where do you go, that's your home base, that you think about these things? And maybe Nate, jump off with you there.
Sure. Well, a lot. The answer is a lot of music. There's music that is overtly tied to social change and protest movements. You mentioned people like Pete Seeger. Whenever I listen to The Times They Are Changing, I think that was Bob Dylan's second album. I think whenever I listen to that album, it's just, I mean, and there are many albums like that, but that album in particular is such a transformative experience for me still, and it just stays with me for hours after I hear it. So there's the music that is really overtly tied to advocacy for social change, which is obviously very powerful and important. But there's also, I don't want to sound too Pollyanna-ish, but I am just a pretty optimistic person generally, and I've always found when I listen to, let's say, a Mozart piano concerto, for example, and think about the enormous amount of human ingenuity and cultural history that goes into the possibility of 100 people sitting in a concert hall, listening to these highly trained musicians play instruments that each individually can represent hundreds of hours of craft. Think about the sum total of human history and all of the ingenuity and the fact that we've evolved from a situation of nasty, brutish, and short lives into being able to do something like that and have that experience. That remains to me. It always has been a stunning thing. And so when I listen to something like a Mozart piano concerto, or really any large, harmonious human endeavor, not just music, it's good to step back and just with awe sometimes and appreciate the possibility of that. And I think that's easy to overlook, but as Sophie says, we're pretty smart. We've accomplished a lot. And I do think that we have the capacity to endure, and not just endure, but endure well. That was an extremely general answer to your question, but those are some thoughts.
They're good thoughts, and I like to hope that that Hobbes has just always been wrong, but we have been drawing this inspiration for all these centuries. So Sophie, how about you?
Yeah, I think definitely I draw a great deal of inspiration from music and art. I love that you mentioned Pete Seeger because I'm kind of a recent convert, but and we actually we arranged a Pete Seeger song and had that as the ending to one of our shows that was more forward thinking. But I think that there's a lot to come out of song. And that's an area musically where I'm not as comfortable, and I would love to be more comfortable. But I think getting people together and just thinking about these things collectively, that's where I get a lot of inspiration, and also from art that does that as well. I think it really is a gathering place, especially live performance or installation. That can just bring a lot of different people into the same room and make them talk to each other. And I think one, this is deviating a little bit, but the one experience I had that I feel so grateful to have been a part of was after a performance, we had a discussion and two people got up and just had a really frank conversation about climate change and what was going on in their own community. And it was kind of like, what are we actually doing here? And just asked each other face to face. And it was such a rewarding and fascinating experience, because I think it's something that we often, climate change is hard because it's slow. I mean, geologically, it's not slow, but we can go through our everyday lives just fine for now. and I think, so it's like these moments where we actually have to sit down and have these conversations, I think are really poignant. And if arts and film and music can stimulate those, then I think that's really, really exciting.
first, I think we have one question here, which was somebody's curious about what Seeger piece you use. So maybe just quickly answer, we can dispose of that.
Yeah, it was Tomorrow is a Highway.
Cool. I love that point about the frank conversation, and I feel like there's a movement here in Maine between, you know, the work that you're doing, the folks that Palaver Strings are doing, that there's a kind of a groundedness and immediacy to the music that provokes conversation, and I guess just for both of you, and maybe Sophie first, is, you know, you both have had these life experiences outside of Maine, and you know, for Fulbright and Nate, I'm sure there's many travels you've gone on. You know, how have those experiences shaped your perspectives about Maine and influenced this work? You know, what are you bringing to this from those experiences? And maybe Sophie, start with you.
Yeah, I think for me, going away or living abroad was hugely influential, in part because it was just opened my eyes to a very, very different way of living in a totally different climate. And also probably most directly, it made me 100% positive that I want to be back in Maine. It just gave me such an appreciation for this place and the people here. And I think to some extent, one of the things that it really kind of hit home, not living here, was how loyal people are, not only to each other, but to this place. I think there's a connection with the ecology here in a way that's really important, and something that probably existed everywhere not that long ago. And it's something I think we've lost as a human culture, is this kind of awareness of our surroundings ecologically. And I really care about that. That's where I get a lot of my own energy and hope, is from those being outside. And I think in Maine, there's more of a culture around that than in other places I've lived. In Samoa, it's even bigger. But I think there's a real appreciation for what we take from the environment, and also what it gives us, but in a way that has some more reciprocity to it. Like we need to acknowledge those things. And I think there's a lot of room for more of that, but I think it's incredibly important. And so that, I think all those travels kind of cemented that for me, as this is a place that I really care about. And I love the connection between people here, and the fact that people kind of drop anything to help each other if someone is in need. And I really value that from a personal standpoint.
Yeah, I agree with everything Sophie just said. The sense of place here is stronger than anywhere else I've lived, or at least anywhere else I've lived for an extended period of time. People are quite connected to nature and the land, and people do generally really value that, I think, and value especially the ones who grew up here. But there is a flip side, which is that can lead sometimes to a sense of nativism or provincialism, and that's something to guard against. That's real, and I think that it's important to not fall into a trap sometimes of congratulating ourselves when something good happens in Maine, or something new happens in Maine specifically, because in some ways, if we want to, we can be the leaders. We don't just need to sort of do things that and celebrate the fact that they're here when they may have been done other places elsewhere 20 years ago. So there, it's a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it's great to have the sense of community in place, but on the other hand, there can be some negative consequences too, and I think it's important to have one's eyes open to that.
What do you see as the role of music in helping kind of open eyes to that, Nate? I think just following up on that is, you know, is how can you, and you both, and how can Halcyon kind of bring that to light? Do you see a role for that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I do. I think that well, people like Sophie and me to some extent who've traveled elsewhere and chosen to settle here, I think can maybe bring some pollination of ideas or activities that maybe are more prevalent elsewhere into our activities here. I think that the biggest thing, though, is just to try to, again, a very general answer, but to live with one's eyes and ears open, and just to try to be as much as possible aware that one's actions do have effects around the world, whether one's consumer habits, artistic habits, anything else. Again, a really general answer, but maybe a good one.
I'm going to rephrase then in light of that answer, just a question from an audience member, which is, I think this going back to this notion of inspirations, and I think we talked about, where you draw, solace and clarity and healing and everything. But, in this last year in 2022, going into 2023, what's been artistically inspiring for you, both, in Maine and around the country, globally, what's really sparking things for you?
That's a great question. I think kind of two thoughts. One, more over the course of the past year, I think coming out of a year and a half where we couldn't really perform as a musician, that's what I do. And that was really hard. Playing on Zoom really doesn't cut it. And so having the opportunity to play for a live audience again was magical. And it felt so, a lot of us musicians get performance anxiety, and it's not always the funnest thing, and you get over it and there's a nice endorphin rush at the end. And but I think that it put a lot in perspective for me about why I do this, and that, those anxieties are real and they're going to happen from time to time, but being able to share with real people and in a space together and gather it is such a gift that I think I've always taken for granted and don't anymore. So that's been a really inspiring, or just artistically feeling very, very grateful to be able to do that. And then secondly, kind of on a more specific, one thing that I've been thinking a lot about very recently in terms of upcoming shows is looking at different media types, and more specifically animation and ways of telling stories that don't necessarily have to be visually dependent on reality. So you can create a story that you couldn't tell with live action film or photography, or and so that's kind of been a really fun hole to go down for me and all of it at Halcyon, just kind of exploring that as an option for future projects and ways to kind of show different realities of where we're going and where we've been.
For me, I'll offer one maybe specific thing and one general thing. And this is very specific, but I've been spending a lot of time with the writings of Carl Jung over the last year. And Jung is what led me to the alchemy piece, Jung's interpretation of alchemy, but more generally, his thoughts on what it means to be a psychologically complete or mature or well integrated, or he might say individuated person, integrating various aspects of one's psyche, even ones that may be hidden or unpleasant. So that's a specific thing I've just been thinking about a lot. Again, apologies, there's some noise in the background. Apologies if that's distracting. The more general thing is just seeing the amazing resilience, and again, this is going to sound Pollyannish, but the amazing resilience of our society in response to the pandemic and how people responded to it. Obviously, there was terrible loss of life. People are still suffering in various ways. School children had their education impeded. But still, we went collectively through this very traumatic experience for many of us. And most of us ended up pretty okay, and our institutions and society ended up pretty okay. And that, again, it's good to step back sometimes and think about how we've managed to build a society that can even suffer such sustained and severe shocks and still be resilient and flexible enough to recover. And that inspires me.
I think that's a beautiful note to end on, and just want to thank you both so much. This has been, I don't often get to host these, and just a wonderful hour together. So thank you both so much. For members of the audience, there's going to be follow-up email. There's going to be some wonderful performances next week and into February. It sounds like or into February in the Midcoast, and so I hope folks are able to take a little road trip and spend some time in Belfast and Waldoboro. But I hope that everyone will join us again next week for another Lunch and Learn on previewing the 2023 legislative session with the Maine's Environmental Priorities Coalition. And so just Sophie, this is where I draw hope from, and thinking about action and finding, how we're employing the next generation of Mainers and making sure that people have good family sustaining wages and the like. And so the EPC is a partnership of almost 40 organizations working together in collaboration that work together each year to identify and advocate for legislation that will have the greatest impact on protecting this place that we love so much and this world that we love so much. So I hope you all will join us next week to find out about the bills we're rallying around in 2023. We've got some great ones coming down, and hear from lawmakers that are working on this, that are leading the charge, and discover how you as citizens can get involved. And so until then, I hope you have a wonderful weekend. And Nate and Sophie, thank you so much. Just what an inspiration. Have a wonderful day, everyone.
Thank you, Will. Thank you, everybody.